When I turned 58, my life stopped looking like something I recognized. A thin line split everything in two before the basement and after it. I used to think the worst blow a man could take was losing his wife. But grief is slow, gentle in its own cruel way. Betrayal is not. Betrayal cuts fast, clean, and usually from the person you'd die to protect. My son Jace began showing up at my house with eyes that kept drifting toward the tree line like he expected someone or something to step out of the dark. His visits made no sense and his words even less, but he always ended with the same vow. I'm protecting you, Dad. Don't ask from what. I should have understood right then. But a father's love can blind a man to warnings carved in stone. Then the paperwork vanished. Signatures appeared that I hadn't written, and that sound, heavy dragging, echoed from the concrete below my floors late at night. One evening I opened the basement door. I expected a wild animal, maybe a broken pipe. Instead, my flashlight hit cold steel, a massive industrial safe standing in the center of the room like it had been waiting for me. And in that moment, the truth settled in my bones. Whatever my son said he was protecting me from was already inside my house. I was 58, the year everything came apart, living alone in a drafty wooden house on the edge of Goodlettsville. Folks around here call it a town, but to me it always felt like a long breath of land pressed between woods and highway. After Lydia passed, the house seemed to grow quieter each season, as if it were settling deeper into the dirt without her. Some nights I thought I could feel that quiet pressing against my chest when I tried to sleep. I worked nights at Turner Steelworks running the floor during third shift. It is a hard job full of noise sparks and repetition, but it kept my mind busy enough that the grief had less room to wander. When you lose someone like Lydia, someone who carried the better half of you, silence becomes the enemy. So I kept myself moving, kept my boots on the concrete, and let the steel drown out whatever lived behind my ribs. My son Jace had been drifting for months by then. 32 years old, one failed job after another, and a temperament that jumped between charm and frustration without much warning. After he got dismissed from Harbor Freight, he spent more time on my porch than in his own apartment. His hours made no sense. Sometimes he showed up before dawn, other times after midnight. He always had this tightness in his jaw like he was listening for something I could not hear. Every visit ended the same way. He would stand near the bottom of the stairs with his hands shoved into his pockets, eyes darting to the windows as if someone stood outside them. Then he would say it. I am protecting you, Dad. Just trust me. The first time he said it, I laughed, because I thought he was joking. The second time I tried to get him to explain. The 10th time the laughter was long gone and all I felt was dread because something in his voice told me he believed it. Then the papers started disappearing. At first it was my bank statements. I keep them in a small oak drawer beside the kitchen table, a habit I have had since the 80s, when everything moved slower and paperwork was something you could hold in your hands. Then it was the insurance files, the pension documents, even my mortgage statements. Jace always had an answer ready. He was reorganizing. He was helping me. He was doing what needed to be done. I did not believe him, but grief and love can twist themselves into all kinds of knots. I did not want another argument, not with the only family I had left. Everything shifted on a cold night in late October, the kind of night where Tennessee drops into your bones without warning. I had just returned from the plant, still smelling of steel dust and machine oil when I heard it. A heavy grind rising through the floorboards beneath my feet. The sound had weight, as if someone were dragging something hard across concrete. The noise came again, slower this time. A scrape, then a faint clank, then silence. It was coming from his basement. Now the basement in that old house was not much. Rough concrete, stacked lumber, a washer older than Jace, and shelves Lydia once kept full of canned peaches and soups for winter. I had no reason to avoid it until the week Jace told me not to go down there. His voice cracked when he said it. "Promise me, Dad. Do not open that door." I remember standing in the living room that night, the lamp throwing a long shadow across the floor. The scraping started again. A small tremor ran up my spine. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on the counter and moved toward the basement door. The air felt colder near it, as if something had seeped up through the cracks around the frame. I turned the knob slowly. It gave just enough to tell me the door was unlocked. I pushed it open an inch. A thin beam of light flashed upward from the darkness below. It hit my eyes, then vanished so quickly I wondered if I imagined it. I whispered Jace's name. No answer. Just another faint scrape of metal far below. I stepped onto the first stair. Then everything exploded upward. Footsteps hammered on concrete. Someone rushed up from the basement, moving fast. I stumbled back as Jace burst into view, his breath ragged, his skin drained of color. He planted both hands on the doorway, blocking me as if I were the intruder. "Do not go down there, Dad." His voice shook. "I mean it." He held my stare like his life depended on it. For a moment I saw something raw in his eyes, fear mixed with something that felt like guilt. He pushed the door shut behind him and leaned against it, breathing hard. I wanted answers, but all he said was the same line that had haunted me for weeks. "I am protecting you." He would not stay the night. He would not explain what I heard or why the basement mattered so much. He left with the same tight walk he had arrived with, looking over his shoulder at the darkness outside. I barely slept. The house creaked and whispered in the cold. Every sound made me think of that grinding noise, the beam of light Jace's face when he saw me on the stairs, and his words. Protecting me from what? Just after sunrise, I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee that had gone cold before I even tasted it. The woods behind the house stretched long and gray, the morning fog threading itself between the trees. That was when I saw him. A man stood at the edge of the tree line, tall and still, facing the house as if he had been there all night. I could not see his face, only the shape of him against the thinning fog. He did not move. He did not call out. He only watched. And in that moment, for the first time since Lydia died, I felt something colder than grief. A sense that whatever Jace feared had already reached my doorstep. For a long moment, I just stood there on the porch, the mug cooling in my hand, trying to understand why a stranger would be watching my house so early in the morning. By the time I stepped off the porch and walked toward the yard, the man slipped back into the trees without a sound. Whoever he was, he knew how to move quietly, and he knew where to find me. I went back inside, locked the door, and leaned my weight against it. The house felt colder than it usually did after sunrise. Maybe it was the October air, or maybe it was the memory of that thin beam of light in the basement. Either way, I could feel something tightening around my life, slow and deliberate, the way steel clamps down when you twist the wrench one click too far. Jace did not show up that morning, which for the first time in months was a relief. I needed my head clear. I needed space to think. And more than anything, I needed to see what he had been hiding from me. The basement waited beneath my feet like a locked jaw. I fetched the old crowbar I kept in the garage. My hands shook more than I wanted to admit as I forced the tool under the door frame. The wood groaned. One more pull, and the latch snapped loose. The door fell inward, releasing a wave of cold, stale air that smelled like dust and rusted metal. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped down. The beam cut through the dim space until it landed on something so out of place it stole the breath from my chest. In the center of the basement sat a massive industrial safe, steel-colored, dented along the corners and impossibly heavy. I knew that shape. Turner Steelworks had used safes like this to store high-value equipment back when the plant handled classified contracts. Most were sold off as scrap nearly 10 years earlier. What was one doing here? I walked around it slowly. My flashlight traced the faded Turner Steelworks logo stamped across the front. The heavy door, the reinforced hinges, the keypad badly scratched as if someone had entered numbers again and again under stress. Nothing about it made sense. I never bought a safe. Lydia had no need for one. And Jace did not have the money or the sense to haul something like this into my basement alone. Then I noticed the floor. Across the concrete were several boot prints, each coated in a thick red clay. I knelt and touched one of them. The clay was dry but powdery, easy to recognize if you had lived in Tennessee as long as I had. It was not from Goodlettsville. This kind of soil came from East Nashville, miles away, which meant someone else had walked through my house, someone who had no trouble getting close enough to leave prints. A cold prickle ran along my arms. The stranger in the trees, the scraping in the night. And now a safe from my workplace sitting in my basement like it belonged there. I stood up slowly, listening for any sound above me. The house was silent, too silent. I needed answers, and Jace was not giving them. Whatever he was tangled in had now seeped into my home, and I no longer believed any part of his story about protecting me. People who protect you do not drag industrial safes into your basement. They do not erase your paperwork. They do not bring strangers to your doorstep in the middle of the night. I could not stay in the house any longer. I grabbed my keys and headed to the plant. The steelworks yard was nearly empty, just a few trucks, and the echo of machinery warming up inside. I walked across the gravel, still trying to steady the anger in my chest, when a woman in a dark jacket stepped out from behind one of the loading docks. She said my name in a careful voice. Ray Calder. I stopped. The badge around her neck read Federal Financial Crimes Division. Special Agent Rowan Pierce. She introduced herself calmly, but her eyes had the sharpness of someone who had already decided what they needed from me. She asked if we could speak in private. I followed her to the quiet edge of the parking lot. Her breath misted in the cold air as she handed me a thin folder. Inside was a loan agreement for $90,000. My name, my address, my signature. I stared at the page. The handwriting looked exactly like mine. The slant, the lift at the end of the R in Calder. Even the slight drop my pen always makes right after the C. Everything was perfect, except that I had never signed it. Not in my lifetime would I take out a loan like that. Rowan spoke gently, but her words felt heavy. Your son is involved with a man named Victor Redden. People call him the broker. He runs a laundering operation through pawn shops and logistics companies in East Nashville. Sometimes he uses people who owe him. Other times, people who do not even realize they are being used. The world narrowed around me. I heard myself say that it was impossible that Jace could not be part of anything like that. But even as I spoke, I felt the doubt rising. The sound in the basement. The safe. The missing documents. The fear in Jace's eyes. It all began lining up into a picture I did not want to see. Rowan closed the folder and looked at me the way doctors look at you when they already know the diagnosis. We have reason to believe your son may be in deeper than he can manage. If he forged your signature once, he may have done it more than once. I backed away from her, the cold gravel shifting under my boots. I told her I needed to get to work, needed to think. She let me go, but not before saying something that followed me all the way home. Mr. Calder, people involved with the broker tend to get hurt. Make sure you stay safe. When I reached my truck, my hands were shaking again. Not from the cold this time. From the realization that whatever Jace had brought into my life was growing larger by the minute. The basement, the safe, the red clay prints, the man in the trees. All of it pointed to one truth I could no longer ignore. Something had already gone very wrong, and I was standing in the middle of it without knowing why. I drove home with the sense that the ground beneath my life had shifted a few inches, just enough to throw off my balance. The roads through Goodlettsville felt unfamiliar, as if someone had taken the map I knew and rearranged it while I was gone. I kept replaying Rowan Pierce's words in my head, her calm certainty, the way she spoke about Jace as if she already knew how the story ended. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized thinking would not bring clarity. I needed answers, and the only place to start was with whatever Jace had done in my name. The next morning, Rowan called and asked me to meet her at the federal office downtown. I considered ignoring the invitation, but something inside me had already surrendered to the truth. I needed to see what she had. If I kept pretending things were normal, I would lose the little bit of ground I still had left. The federal building was colder than I expected, all polished stone and glass that reflected faces back at you. She led me into a conference room with a plain table and a stack of folders that looked too heavy to belong to one man. She opened the first folder and slid it toward me. Loan applications, credit cards, transaction forms. My name at the top of each page. My handwriting at the bottom. I picked up one of the documents and traced the signature with my finger. The slant of the letters, the way the loop in the Y dipped low, even the slight pressure mark at the end where my hand always stiffened. If I had not known better, I would have sworn I had signed every one of them. I asked how any of this was possible. Rowan did not blink. Your son worked under a man named Terrence Miles. You know him as Terry. He supervised the temporary staff in finance at Turner Steelworks before he was promoted. Your son was assigned to him for 3 months. She watched my reaction carefully, as if measuring how far the shock spread. Terry had been a friend for years, someone I had shared break-room lunches and hunting stories with. Someone who once brought Lydia flowers when she came through surgery. I asked why Jace never mentioned working with him. Rowan said Jace had been flagged as promising, then his contract ended abruptly and without explanation. After that, a series of transactions began appearing in my name, each one small enough to slip by unnoticed, until the totals grew large. I told her there had to be some mistake. She did not argue. Instead, she opened another folder and laid a single sheet of paper in front of me. The air left my lungs when I saw the handwriting. It was Lydia's. 7 years ago, she filed an internal complaint at Turner Steelworks about embezzlement in the finance division. She withdrew it a few weeks later. I stared at the date, trying to remember anything that might connect. But 7 years is long enough for memories to blur. Lydia never told me she filed the complaint. She never told me she withdrew it either. The thought that she hid something that large twisted inside me. I asked Rowan why she was showing me this. She said only one reason. Someone at the plant had been stealing money for years, and someone close to that someone had tried to expose the truth. We believe your wife may have been threatened. Her voice softened. People do not withdraw complaints unless they are afraid or they are silenced. The room felt smaller. I pushed back from the table and stood up because sitting took too much effort. Pieces of my life were rearranging themselves right in front of me, but instead of falling into place, they shifted into a shape I did not recognize. I asked Rowan who else knew about the complaint. She told me only a few executives and whoever the complaint involved. That meant Terry. Miles had been finance operations at the time. If he was involved, then Jace's sudden role under him was not an accident. It was a doorway. On the drive home, I kept seeing Lydia at the kitchen table, the way she tapped her pen when she thought hard. Had she known something that could have destroyed Terry? Had she tried to protect me by keeping it quiet? The questions piled up faster than I could sort them. When I turned into my driveway, I knew something was off before I even got out of the truck. The garage door hung crooked, the metal dented inward, the lock snapped clean. I walked inside slowly, waiting for the rush of anger or fear, but what I felt instead was a cold resignation. The place had been ransacked, boxes overturned, tools scattered, shelving pulled apart. But only one section looked deliberately searched. The old cardboard boxes where Lydia kept her files, journals, and letters. Every other box was untouched. Someone had been looking for something she left behind. Something she never told me about. Something connected to Terry, the complaint, and Jace. I stood there in the center of that wrecked space, and for the first time since this began, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not about my son losing his way or falling in with the wrong people. This was not about a loan or a forged signature, or even the safe downstairs. This went back years. Back to the time when Lydia was still alive. Back to secrets she kept to protect me. Secrets that were resurfacing whether I wanted them to or not. And lurking behind all of it was a man I once trusted, a man who had quietly threaded himself through my work, my son's life, and now the ruins of my home. Whatever was coming, it had started long before Jace ever set foot in my basement. I stayed in the garage a long time after realizing someone had gone through Lydia's boxes. The air felt tight around me, heavy with the kind of silence that makes your thoughts echo. I kept sifting through the ruined stacks, even though I knew whoever had searched them had already taken what they wanted. By the time I stepped back into the house, the sun had dropped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the living room. Every shadow felt like a reminder that I had spent years walking beside a truth I never bothered to see. I went down to the basement. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was exhaustion, but I knew whatever answers still existed were sitting inside that steel safe. I walked toward it slowly, the concrete cold under my feet. The safe looked older in the dim light, its corners worn, its keypad scratched and dinged from someone punching at it with more urgency than patience. I tried to think like Jace. If he had put something inside this safe, he would have chosen a code he believed meant something to both of us. I tried his birthday. Nothing. I tried mine. Nothing. Then, without thinking too hard, I tried the date we lost Lydia. 08/14/2019. The keypad blinked once, then clicked. A soft metallic release echoed through the basement, and I felt something shift in my chest. I pulled the handle. The door groaned open like it had not moved in years. Inside, rows of tightly bundled bills sat in neat stacks. Not a few $100s, but piles of cash amounting to more than I had seen in one place in my life. I counted the bundles twice before accepting the number. $180,000. Beneath the cash were folders stamped with lending company names I vaguely recognized from local news stories, the kind that preyed on desperate people who needed quick money and ended up paying with their livases. I pushed the folders aside and saw a large envelope sealed with tape. Lydia's handwriting stretched across the front. My hand trembled as I picked it up. I recognized her looping letters, the way she always pressed too hard at the beginning of every word. I opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Her message was short. If Jace ever loses his way, remember the promise we made. Do not let him carry my burden alone. I read it twice, then a third time. What burden? What promise? I searched my memory, but Lydia never spoke of anything that required secret safes or hidden letters or stolen documents. Grief can dull memories, but not enough to erase something like this. There had been no promise. Or if there had, I had failed to understand it. I kept digging. Under the envelope was a small flash drive taped to the wall of the safe. I pulled it off and plugged it into a battery-powered reader I kept for work. An audio file popped up. I pressed play. The voice hit me like a fist. Terry Miles. Low, familiar, and dripping with a kind of bitterness I had never heard from him. Jace will do anything for his old man. That makes him perfect. Nobody questions a son trying to help his father. There was more, but my hands were shaking too much to listen. I shut it off and leaned against the wall. Terry. A man I had fished with. A man who had stood beside me at Lydia's funeral. A man who had smiled at my family for decades. And now I could hear him talking about my son like he was a tool, a shield, something to hide behind. At the bottom of the safe, nestled against the steel, was a small brass key. It had a code etched into it. TSW Archive 87. I recognized the meaning immediately. Turner Steelworks Personnel Archive Room 87. A restricted room I had never been allowed near. Only management and finance had access. Terry's department. I held the key in my hand and felt the weight of everything shifting again. The safe was never meant to hide something from Jace. He had put it here, or helped put it here, to hide something from me. Everything he had done, every strange visit, every frightened glance toward the windows, had been tied to this. He had been walking a tightrope between protecting me and being used by men who saw him as disposable. I closed the safe gently and sat on the cold concrete. For a moment I could feel Lydia beside me the way I used to on quiet nights when we folded laundry or talked about Jace's future. She had carried something heavy near the end of her life, and she had not trusted me with it. Maybe she thought she was protecting me. Maybe she thought I could not handle it. Or maybe she had planned to tell me and never got the chance. The basement felt smaller the longer I stayed, like the air itself was trying to push me upward toward the truth waiting above. The safe still sat in the middle of the floor, its door open like a mouth that had finally spoken. I knew now that none of this was about a loan or a forged name. It was about a trail that began years earlier, a trail Lydia had tried to follow, and one Jace had been forced onto. When I finally climbed the stairs and shut off the basement light, I did not feel fear. I felt a hard, steady anger beginning to take shape. Whatever this promise was that Lydia mentioned, I knew one thing. Whatever truth she had carried alone, I would not let Jace carry the rest of it without me. And somewhere inside Turner Steelworks, behind that locked archive door, the next piece of her secret was waiting. I barely slept that night after leaving the basement. Lydia's letter stayed with me, the words circling in my head as I paced from room to room, trying to understand what she had carried alone. By the time darkness settled over the house again, I had replayed every conversation we ever had in her final months, searching for hints I might have missed. The truth is, love can blind a man to the storms building right beside him. I had trusted Lydia's strength so completely that I never imagined she might be shielding me from something darker than sickness. It was close to 10 when I heard a car pull up in the driveway. The tires crunched slow on the gravel, hesitant, almost apologetic. I stepped to the window and saw Jace climbing out of the passenger seat. He looked smaller than I remembered, as if the weight of everything had pressed his shoulders inward. A young woman stepped out on the driver's side. She kept glancing at the road, her hands trembling, even in the glow of the porch light. I opened the door before they reached the steps. She introduced herself as Marcy. The name meant nothing to me, but the fear in her eyes felt too familiar. I had seen it in Jace for weeks. She told me she worked at a pawn shop in East Nashville, and her voice faltered when she mentioned that the shop had ties to a man called the broker. I asked her why she was here. She swallowed hard, then said, Jace had broken a deal. Her gaze slid to him, almost pleading for him to continue. Jace took a step forward, but he did not speak right away. His mouth moved like he was trying to form words he had been holding back too long. Then his knees gave out, and he sank onto the porch, like a man too exhausted to stand beneath the truth any longer. He said he had messed up. He said Terry had offered him a job, promised him stability, told him he could help him rebuild his life after Harper Freight let him go. He said Terry made things sound easy, just a few signatures to help with internal reports, just a few accounts that needed someone trustworthy to manage them temporarily, just a little favor to get him back on his feet. But each signature had been mine. Each account had been a place to move money that was never supposed to be seen. And each step had tightened a rope around his neck. He looked up at me, tears filling the corners of his eyes. Terry wants you to take the fall. He said Mom tried to expose him years ago. He never forgave it. The porch spun for a moment. Lydia, her complaint, her silence. The fear she must have felt knowing the man she once worked beside was capable of this. I asked him what he meant about exposing Terry. Jace said he had found a file in her things years ago, before she got too sick to follow through. Terry knew she had something on him. That was why he needed leverage, and that leverage had become my son. Marcy stepped closer. She said the broker expected $150,000 within 72 hours. If the money did not appear, the debt would be shifted to me. That was the deal Jace had ruined by refusing to sign another forged document. She kept wringing her hands. I asked her why she was helping him. She said she could not stand by anymore after seeing what the broker did to other families. She said Jace was drowning, and someone needed to pull him out before it killed him or me. I looked at my son. His hands were shaking. His breath came in short bursts. He kept wiping at his face like he was ashamed of the tears. But he was not ashamed. He was tired. Tired of carrying something no one should carry alone. When I stepped forward and put my arms around him, he collapsed against my chest the way he used to when he was a little boy who scraped his knee. He did not say he was sorry. He did not make excuses. He just sobbed into my shirt, not from guilt, but from relief. That was when I understood the truth of all his strange visits and whispered warnings. He had never been trying to protect that safe or the secrets inside it. He had been trying to protect me from a man who had already torn through our family once. I held him until his breathing steadied. Then I led him inside, Marcy following close behind, still glancing over her shoulder like she expected headlights to appear at any moment. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Lydia once braided Jace's hair before his first day of kindergarten. The same table where we celebrated birthdays and planned summers we never took. Now it held the weight of a confession that changed the shape of our family forever. I asked Jace what exactly Terry held over him. He wiped his face and told me Terry had files, documents that could make it look like Jace had acted alone. If anything happened with the federal investigation, Terry intended for my son to be the one standing in front of the judge, not him, not the broker. Jace had been chosen because he was desperate, and because Terry knew how much I loved him. The room fell quiet. Outside, a wind moved through the trees, brushing against the house with a low, restless whisper. Whatever had started 7 years ago was rising again, stronger and far more dangerous. I stared at my son, at the boy I raised, who had turned into a man carrying a secret he never asked for. I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, and beneath it, the hope that maybe this time he did not have to carry the weight alone. Before I could speak, something rattled faintly outside like gravel shifting under a slow footstep. Marcy froze. Jace's head snapped toward the window, and I felt the same cold prickle along my spine that I had felt the morning I saw the man standing at the tree line. The sound outside faded as quickly as it came, but the look on Jace's face stayed with me long after Marcy drove away, and he went upstairs to sleep on the couch. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, watching the dark lift from the windows, while pieces of the truth kept rearranging themselves in my mind. By the time the sun came up, I knew what I had to do. Protecting Jace would not mean hiding him. It would mean facing whatever had pulled him into this mess. I drove to the federal building with the envelope of evidence pressed against my chest. Rowan met me in the lobby and led me into a quiet room. I emptied the contents onto the table. The USB, the loan contracts, Lydia's letter, the ledgers showing payments funneling through East Nashville addresses. All of it sat there, small enough to fit in a single folder, yet heavy enough to shift the ground beneath every truth I had believed. Rowan studied each item with the calm focus of someone who had seen too many lives torn apart by the same kind of corruption. When she finally looked up, her expression told me what I already feared. Terry Miles had been siphoning money from Turner Steelworks for years. The broker laundered it through pawn shops and backroom accounts, and Jace had been used to divert suspicion, coached to forge my name because the signature of a middle-aged steel supervisor did not raise red flags the way a young temp's might. I felt anger rising through my ribs, hot and sharp. Not anger at Jace, at myself. I had worked beside Terry for half my life without seeing what lived under his easy smile. Rowan laid the USB drive on the table and said the recording left no doubt. Terry had not just manipulated Jace. He had positioned him as the perfect fall guy. If the investigation ever closed in, the blame would fall neatly on the son of a man too honest to understand what had been happening beneath his feet. I left the office with a heaviness I had not felt since the day the doctor told me Lydia's cancer had spread. It followed me into a small diner off Gallatin Pike, where I met Hal Givens, a retired coworker who had called me the night before. He sat in a booth by the window, the morning sun outlining his white hair like chalk. Hal had always been a quiet man at the plant, the kind who listened more than he spoke. He gripped his coffee mug when I sat down and told me that near the end of Lydia's life she had confided in him. She had proof Terry was embezzling funds and planned to expose him. But as her sickness worsened, she grew afraid. Not of dying, Hal said, but of what Terry would do to me if she made the accusation. So she hid the evidence in a place only Jace could reach. She trusted him to protect me if she could not. Hearing her name broke something open inside me. I asked Hal why he never told me. He said he thought Lydia would come forward herself. And after she died, he assumed the truth had died with her. I sat there in the diner with my hands pressed to my face, trying to breathe through the ache that came with knowing the woman I loved had spent her final months carrying a secret alone to keep me safe. Jace had inherited that burden without ever understanding what it would cost him. On my way home, my phone rang. Jace. His voice shook with exhaustion and fear. He said he had found something in Lydia's files, something she hid years ago, something she meant for me to see only when the danger finally reached our doorstep. He said he had Mom's original documents, the ones that could break everything open. But then his voice dropped lower. He told me I could not come near Terry. If Terry suspected I knew the truth, he would kill me before I had time to run. A rustling sound came through the phone, followed by a sharp breath. Then the line went dead. I sat in my truck with the phone pressed to my ear long after the call ended, listening to the empty static and the sound of my own pulse pounding in my head. Whatever path Lydia had started, and whatever path Jace had been forced onto both roads, were now leading straight toward the same place. And I knew with a clarity that cut through every fear I carried that there was only one way this would end. I sat in my truck long after the call, disconnected, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The night around me felt too still, as if the world itself were waiting for whatever came next. Jace's warning echoed through me. If Terry suspected I knew the truth, he would kill me. Not threaten, not manipulate. Kill. It should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, a strange clarity settled over me, the kind that comes when a man finally stops running from the storm and walks straight into it. I messaged Rowan one short line, the only thing I had the strength to type. He has Mom's documents. I'll let you know where. Then I started the engine and headed toward Rivergate. The roads were empty, the street lamps flashing past, like brief reminders that I was still moving, still breathing. The sky hung low and heavy, early winter clouds pressing down like a warning. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting the black SUV from the tracker alerts Rowan had mentioned, but the only thing behind me was dark asphalt stretching into more darkness. The Walmart lot looked bigger at night than it ever did during the day. The overhead lights flickered with a tired pulse, throwing uneven shadows across rows of empty parking spaces. When I pulled in and turned off the engine, the silence hit me full force. It felt like stepping into a place where time stalled just enough for decisions to take shape. A small car rolled in from the far side of the lot. I recognized it before I recognized the figures stepping out. Jace, Marcy. They moved quickly, heads down, clutching something between them. When they reached my truck, Jace opened the door without speaking. His face looked thinner, drawn tight with fear and determination. Marcy's hands trembled around a manila folder. Jace handed it to me. Mom hid these. Even Terry didn't know they existed. You need to give them to the right people. His voice cracked on the last words. I opened the folder. Inside were handwritten notes, photocopied financial ledgers, and a typed statement bearing Lydia's name. It was everything she had tried to report 7 years ago. And it was enough to destroy Terry's entire operation. Before I could speak, headlights swept across us, flooding the lot with a harsh white glare. A black SUV glided toward us and stopped without a sound. The doors opened. Victor Redden stepped out first. The broker. He looked calm, as if midnight meetings in abandoned parking lots were just another chore. His eyes flicked over me like he was sizing up the worth of something he had already purchased. Then Terry Miles stepped out behind him. He was holding a gun. His face twisted with a mix of triumph and resentment that chilled the air around us. Lydia ruined my life, he said. She tried to turn me in. Now I take hers through you. My heart hammered so loudly I barely heard him. I looked at Jace. His jaw clenched, but he didn't move. Terry took a step closer. He raised the gun with slow confidence, like a man who believed fate was finally leaning his way. But I had already made my move. Before leaving the house, I had sent Rowan another message. Rivergate. Midnight. Bring backup. Just as Terry steadied his aim, the far end of the lot lit up with a sudden blaze of blue and white. Federal vehicles pulled in from every direction, tires screeching, doors swinging open. Agents ran out in coordinated silence, moving like a tide closing around prey. The broker turned to run, but didn't get far. 3 agents tackled him before he reached the curb. His body hit the pavement with a thud. Terry bolted toward the side of the building, but he underestimated the one thing he had taken for weakness. My son. Jace sprinted after him. I saw the moment Terry turned to fire, saw the flash of panic cross his face when the shot misfired, the weapon jamming. And in that split second, Jace lunged, slamming Terry to the ground. The gun skittered across the concrete. Jace pinned him with a strength I had not seen since he was a teenager, fighting to win his first wrestling match. Agents swarmed them, pulling Terry away and locking him in cuffs. He shouted threats that drifted into meaningless noise as they shoved him toward a waiting vehicle. Then the agents turned to Jace. He didn't fight. He simply held out his wrists and let them bind him, his eyes finding mine. I saw something in them I had not seen in years: resolve and the faintest glimmer of peace. Rowan approached me while they loaded Jace into the back of a car. She spoke softly, as if she knew every word would cut deeply. "Your son acted under duress. What he did tonight proves where he stands. I'll argue for leniency." I nodded, unable to speak. As the cars began to pull away, I watched my son disappear behind tinted glass. My heart hurt with every beat, but pride rose through the ache. For the first time since Lydia died, I saw the man Jace could have been the man he still might become. The lot grew quiet again. The flashing lights faded into the distance, and I stood alone in the cold midnight air, knowing nothing in my life would ever be the same. When the last flash of blue and red slipped over the far edge of the lot, the dark settled in around me, wide and empty. I drove home on autopilot, hands on the wheel, mind somewhere between the past and whatever future had just been forced on us. There are nights that mark a clean line down the middle of a man's life, before and after. That one sat right on the fault line. The house felt different when I walked in, like the air itself knew something had broken open. I made it as far as the kitchen table before my legs gave up, and I sat down hard in the old chair where Lydia used to sort mail and make grocery lists. Jace's face kept replaying in my mind, the quiet way he held out his wrists, the way he looked back at me through that car window. There was fear in his eyes, but there was something else too, something steadier. For the first time in a long time, he had chosen which way to stand. Sleep did not come, not that night, and not the next. The days blurred. Federal agents called. There were follow-up questions, statements to sign, meetings at Turner Steelworks, as the board scrambled to distance itself from Terry. News spread through the plant like fire through dry brush. Some men were angry, some were stunned. A few said they had always suspected something was off. I just kept my head down and answered what needed answering. It was maybe 3 weeks after the Walmart lot when I went back down into the basement. I had been avoiding it. That safe felt like a tomb now, holding not just cash and contracts, but years of fear and silence. Still, there was a pull I could not ignore. I opened the door and flipped on the light. Dust motes drifted in the beams, slow and careless, as if they had all the time in the world. The safe still sat in the center of the floor, door closed, but no longer locked. I knelt down, ran my hand along the inside, checking every corner, every seam. That was when my fingers caught on a thin ridge in the back panel. I pressed it and felt a small latch shift. A square section of the interior wall swung loose. Behind it was another envelope. My chest tightened when I saw the writing. Lydia's hand again, a little shakier than on the first note, like she had written it when the illness was already stealing her strength. I sat on the floor and opened it carefully. She wrote that if I was reading this, it meant the truth had finally reached me. She admitted she had known for years that Terry was stealing from the company, that he was using numbers and names that did not belong to him. She wrote that she had filed the complaint and then pulled it back when she realized he would not just lose his job, he would come after me. She did not think I would survive that kind of war. So she made a choice. She gave the files to Jace because she believed Terry would underestimate a restless young man more than an old coworker. She asked our son to keep them hidden and to watch me when she no longer could. She told him to wait until someone came looking. When they did, he was supposed to bring everything into the light, even if it meant dragging his own mistakes along with it. The last line of the letter stayed with me long after I refolded the page. She wrote that if our son stumbled on that road, I needed to remember that he had been carrying her burden and mine. She asked me not to let anger swallow the love she knew still lived in me. I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. For the first time since this all began, I cried. Not the quiet tears that slip out in the dark, but the kind that shake your shoulders and leave your face raw. I cried for Lydia for the fear she had lived with to keep me safe. I cried for Jace for the years he spent trying to hold back a tide no one his age should have had to face. And I cried for myself for the blind comfort I had wrapped around my life, thinking hard work and routine could keep the world from pushing in. A few days later, Turner Steelworks called a formal meeting. The board sat at a long, polished table looking tired and older than I remembered, like the scandal had carved years off their lives. They thanked me for my cooperation. They assured me that Terry would face charges. Then they made an offer. They wanted me to step into his role, head of operations, more money, more responsibility, a kind of promotion I might have dreamed about once before all this. I listened. Then I told them no. I said I had spent my life keeping the machines running and the floors safe, and that was enough. I said I did not want the office where Terry had sat and planned the lies that almost ruined my family. They looked surprised. One of them called it humility. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was just clarity. Some doors a man does not walk through no matter how shiny they look from the hallway. That night I wrote a letter to Jace. I told him the truth had not destroyed us. It had hurt, and it had taken pieces we would never get back. But it had also burned away the lies that had stood between us. I told him his mother had trusted him more than he ever knew. I told him the chair by the fireplace was still his, that this house would always be his home when he was ready to come back as the man he was meant to be. Then I went to the basement one last time. I had borrowed a cutting torch from a friend at the plant, the kind we use to break down old metal. The safe did not go quietly. It sparked and screamed as the steel split and folded inward, the sound echoing up through the house. By the time I was done, it was nothing but twisted scrap and broken hinges. I cleaned up the mess, wiped the sweat from my face, and switched off the light. Outside, the air over Goodlettsville felt different, lighter somehow. I stood on the porch and listened to the wind moving through the trees, the same wind that had once carried the shape of a stranger at the tree line watching my home. The stranger was gone now. The danger he represented had a name and a prison cell waiting on it. What stayed was something quieter, a sense that for all the damage done we had stepped back onto solid ground. I thought about the men who might hear this story and see their own sons in Jace or their own blind spots in me. I thought about the way secrets eat through families, the way pride can keep a father from asking the hard questions until it is almost too late. If any part of what happened to us sounds familiar to you, I would ask you to sit with it a while. Share it with someone you trust. Talk about it. Think about the things left unsaid in your own house, the people you might need to call the truths you might be avoiding. And if you want to hear where our road goes from here, what kind of man my son becomes on the other side of all this, then stay close. Listen on, there is more to tell.